In this tutorial, I will show you how to make a basic Spring Boot application that you'll be able to use as a template for all of your future projects. So to start, go to IntelliJ. If you have IntelliJ Premium like this, you'll be able to just open a new file, a new project, and then go from Spring Boot from here. If not, you can go on this website, start.spring.io, to make the same thing and then import it to IntelliJ and work on that. So here we'll create a new project. I'll give it a name, user application. Then you'll have to choose Maven, and for the group you can choose anything, so my application, for example. And everything else is correct. Next, here in the dependencies, here are the dependencies that we'll need. So DevTools, Spring Boot DevTools, then H2 database, Spring Web, this one, then JPA, Spring Data JPA, and finally Lombok. So here are the 5 dependencies that we'll need. Once it's done, you can close this, right click. So the first thing that we'll do is create a database. To create a database, what we need to do is create a new file here, a normal file, and call it data.sql, and another file called schema.sql. In the schema, I'll just add this. So basically we drop the table if it exists, and then we create the table. This is what we're going to be working with. The users, they will have an ID, first name, last name, date of birth, email, and password. So in the future, we're going to have to hide the password and the ID. I'll show you how to make that. In the data, I'll just copy paste this, because this is just some dummy data. So now that we have the database set up, we can go to application properties. Obviously your database is going to be different depending on your application. Here, these are the necessary properties that we'll have to set up, because this is to connect the database to your application. Then next thing we'll do, now that we have our database completely set up, we need to make the 3 layers for our application. So as we've learned, it's the data access layer, data mapper, presentation, and service layer. Actually, the data mapper is an extra layer. It isn't very necessary, but we'll add it still. So first, presentation layer, then right click, package, service, then data access, and finally the extra one, data mapper. So now that we have all the layers set up, let's start with the data access layer. We'll make a Java class and call it user. This is going to be our main entity. In here, we're going to have to annotate it as an entity first, then connect it to the table, to the database, with the table named users, so that it knows where it connects in the database. Finally, let's add the data. This basically will add setters, getters, and constructors, so that we don't have to add them manually. Here we need private ID, first name, last name, date of birth, email, and password. Here local data, you can import it. Then the ID, it has to have some annotations because it is a special parameter, and so generated value strategy. There you go. Next thing is adding an interface in the same layer, data access layer. The interface is user repository, and that will just extend JPA repository. Here in the JPA repository, we're adding user and integer. They're specifying what's the entity that this repository is going to work with, and what is going to be the primary key. So the primary key, since it's a ID integer, it's going to be integer here. So once we have this, we can go and work on our DTOs now. So in the presentation layer, let's make a Java class, and we'll make 2 DTOs, user response DTO and user request DTO. So the response DTO is what is going to be sent to the user once they make a call to our program API call. Here, first of all, we need to add the data annotation, and then basically the response is almost the same as this, so we can copy paste this to our response. But since we don't want the response to include the ID and the password, we're going to remove them. So one thing I forgot to do here in the user response DTO, just add this age field, so that we'll see that later. However, the request DTO is going to have everything here. So data once again. Next thing is going to be our mapper, because we want to map the user entity to our DTOs. So data mapper layer, create a class user mapper. Here in the mapper, give it an annotation of component, like that, and we'll have two mappers. The two mappers will go from entity to DTO and from DTO to entity. So the first one will return a response DTO. It will be called user to response DTO. So it will transform the user, which it accepts here, to a response DTO. The second one is going to be the opposite here. So let me import these first. Here, make sure to select your user, which is in data access layer, because this one is not from your application. This is our user, so this class specifically. Now that the mapper is done, we can work on the service layer. So in the service layer, first of all, let's make an interface called user service. So the user service is a simple interface where we will add the methods that the service is going to implement later. So all the CRUD operations, get, create, update, delete. Here, let me import these. So this is how it's going to look like. Then let's create a Java class called user service implementation. And this is what is actually going to implement everything. So let's give it a service annotation here. So this user service implementation, what it's going to need is these two fields first. Oops. So it's going to need all of these two fields, but we also need to do a constructor injection to auto-wire them here. So auto-wired public, there we go. This is the constructor, and import this, import that, there we go. So this is where the implementation of all the CRUD operations is going to go. So here's the first one. We're going to start with override annotation. So in this create user, what we're going to do is first, when we accept this request DTO, we're going to use the mapper to transform it to an entity. So this is the user entity, and we're going to save it to the repository. Then this basically is responsible for when in Postman, for example, we create a new user and we send the request, the response is going to be the DTO, basically, the response DTO. So what's happening here basically is we're making a new response DTO, and we're setting the age to the period. We're using this library period between saved user date of birth and the date of right now. Then we're getting the years of that and returning that. So now we're going to make the next CRUD operation, which is update user. So here's what it's going to look like. Here, first of all, we need to check if this ID actually exists, because if we want to update the user and the user doesn't really exist in the database, it's going to make an exception. So first we make an optional variable user and find the user by ID. If the user is present, we're going to make a new user using this request DTO, set the ID to that user, and save it to the repository. Here, it's the same thing as this. This is for just for the API to show this. If the user is not there, we're going to just return null. Next is our delete method. It's very simple. So same thing, we find the user with an optional. If it doesn't exist, return null. If it exists, we just delete it. Here, instead of doing this response DTO, we return a string, because once the user is deleted, we cannot show its DTO. Finally, I forgot to, at the beginning, add the get all users. So basically what's going to do is find all the users, create a list of them, then create another list of response DTOs. That's just an empty list. Then we're going to go through all of the user entities, and we're going to map these into response DTOs. And then before adding them to this list of response DTOs, we're going to set the age. So since our response DTOs have an age, here in our response DTOs, we also need to calculate the age and add it and set it in the response DTO before adding to this list. Once it's done, we just return the list, and that's it. Also here, I forgot to implement this user service. This will just ensure that we are using these to make our methods. So once we have all of this set up, we can go to presentation layer and create the controller. So user controller. In the controller, the annotations that we're going to have to add is our REST controller request mapping. In the request mapping, we're going to add this API/v1/users, and this is pretty much it. So let me import these. So once these are all imported, we have this constructor with a constructor injection auto-wired here to get this user service. Then we also have this get users, which uses the response entity. This ensures that we have exception handling, and this is actually used everywhere in our controller response entity to handle the exceptions. Then we have the create user, update user, and delete user. These two require this /ID because we need to access a user that is already in the database. And that's pretty much it. So now let's run this application. So once you run it, you'll have this pop-up saying that Lombok requires enabled annotation processing. So you click on this, restart. So when you run your application, if you get this exception, that's a very annoying exception, you can go to your POM.xml. Here at the end, you can see configuration that excludes Lombok. Lombok is actually what we need here. So remove that. Then also remove this configuration, Lombok here. Once you remove them, you can refresh Maven and restart the application. If it still doesn't work, go back to your POM.xml. Then this dependency, the one we need, which is Lombok, delete it first, refresh Maven, start the application. It's going to give you another exception. Then go back to POM.xml and Ctrl Z so that it goes back, this one. Refresh Maven again and restart the application, and now it will work. Now it doesn't have any warnings, it works, and we can test it with Postman. Here in Postman, what you do basically, let me delete this first. So you create a collection, blank collection. You call it, in our case, user application. And then right click, add request. This is our get request, so get users. Here you enter the API address and send. So this works. Then you can add the create user. This is a post request. There you go. In the body, actually here, we're gonna take this JSON from the get users and put it in the raw body here. And here you can change it to anything you want. For example, this. Then actually here we don't need the age because the request DTO, as we can see here, doesn't have the age. However, it has the password and the ID. So here you should add the ID. For example, actually you don't have to add the ID because the ID in the schema, it's auto incremented. It's handled by the database itself, so we don't need to handle it manually. Instead, we only need the password. So password. There we go. Don't forget the comma here, and that should be it. So once you send this request, it'll show you what's actually in the database now. So it will calculate the age based on the date of birth that you gave here. If you see that this get didn't update, you can just Control S to save it Now it updates here. Let's make the other requests. So this is update user. This is put. Same thing here. And then users. Since when in the update we need to update an existing user, we can pick, for example, this one, which is 1. The ID is 1. So here, since we don't see the IDs because they're hidden, because this is a DTO, you can go to the internet and type localhost 8080/h2. This was what it's going to give you. So localhost 8080/h2. Here's the interface. You enter the password that was in application properties. So user and pwd, for example, connect. Once you connect, you can click on users, run, and see all of the users that we that we have in the database. So this is the, as you can see, the user that I added. They all have IDs. So for example, here in Postman, when we update the user, we can enter this ID in the URL. So for example, 6, which is this last user. Then you click on raw to modify it. We'll copy it from here. And for example, I want to change this to low. There we go. If you refresh this, you'll see that it's updated. Now for the last one, okay, and also control save so that it updates here. Last request, delete, and this doesn't need the body, so delete user. Just send. User deleted successfully. Here we can see the user is not there. Here too, user not there. So that's basically it, and the application is done.